The security drone hummed as it glided down Corridor 7 of the Galactic Cooperative Research Station Veyrath Prime. Its twin sensor arrays swept left and right in rhythmic arcs, infrared, biosignature, thermal, motion, cataloging every heartbeat, every breath, every unauthorized presence aboard the station. It had flagged 17 violations this cycle alone. Corridor 7, however, came back clean. White heavy checkmark, all personnel accounted for. White heavy checkmark, no unauthorized biological signatures detected. White heavy checkmark, no thermal anomalies. The drone moved on. Behind it, in Lab Bay 14, Specialist Mara Ellison didn't even look up from her data terminal. She just reached up with one hand and gave the large lump inside the front pocket of her oversized gray hoodie a gentle, reassuring pat. The lump shifted. Tiny claws pricked briefly against the fabric from the inside. A sound emerged, somewhere between a purr and a subsonic growl, so low that no sensor array in the building was calibrated to detect it. Kale Vera, crown cub of the Drevathi apex predator clan, age 4 solar cycles, apex predator in training, heir to a warrior lineage that had never once been bested in 300 years of galactic conflict, tucked his nose under his sibling's chin and went back to sleep. It had started, like most disasters, with paperwork. 3 weeks ago, the Drevathi ambassador had arrived at Veyrath Prime with an entourage. The Drevathi were not known for subtlety. They stood 2.5 meters tall, had retractable claws capable of scoring durasteel plating, possessed 6 rows of teeth, 4 functional, 2 ceremonial, and communicated primarily through a combination of subsonic vibration and direct eye contact that caused most species to experience involuntary biological responses best described as fleeing instincts. The cooperative had assigned 5 diplomats to manage the ambassador's arrival. 4 had submitted medical leave requests by the end of the first day. The 5th, a Velquari named Wa, had survived only because their species lacked the nervous system pathways required to feel existential dread. Wa had stood in the receiving bay, clipboard in hand, blinking all 7 of their eyes pleasantly, and said, "Welcome to Veyrath Prime. Your quarters are on level 9. Please note that unauthorized claw usage on structural beams is a disciplinary infraction under Station Code 7 Gamma." The ambassador had stared. Wa had stared back. "I will note your species' apparent immunity to social pressure," the ambassador had finally said. "I find it mildly irritating." "That is wonderful feedback," Wa had replied, and handed him a welcome packet. The cubs had arrived 3 days later. Nobody had put them on the manifest. This was, it turned out, a very Drevathi thing to do. Cubs were not considered people in a diplomatic sense. They were considered attachments. Like luggage, but with teeth. There were 5 of them. Kale Vera, who was 4, had immediately identified himself as the leader by biting Kale's nearest sibling on the ear and making a sound like an avalanche. New York, who was 3.5, had retaliated by sitting on Kale's head. Day, who was 3, had gotten distracted by a ventilation grate and tried to unscrew it. Hai, who was 2, had fallen asleep under the ambassador's official chair and refused to move. Me, who was barely 18 months old and still had her milk teeth, had looked at the assembled diplomatic staff with enormous golden eyes, made a sound like a distressed thunderstorm, and then tried to eat a datapad. The ambassador had watched his offspring scatter across the diplomatic receiving room like a small, furry, apex predator explosion and had turned to Station Director Joe. "You will manage them," he said. It was not a request. Director Joe, a compact, gray-haired human woman with the energy of someone who had long since burned through her capacity for surprise, had looked at the 5 small carnivores currently dismantling the room around her and said, "Yep. Sure. Well, find me a specialist with a flexible schedule." That was how Mara Ellison had entered the picture. Mara was a xenobiological data specialist. She worked with alien organic samples, cross-referenced biosignature databases, and updated taxonomic records for newly catalogued species. It was quiet work. Methodical work. Work that required a certain level of focused solitude. The cubs had destroyed her solitude within approximately 4 minutes of meeting her. But here was the thing about Drevathy cubs: they were, underneath the claws and the subsonic growling and the teeth, functionally similar to any other apex predator juvenile in the galaxy. They needed warmth. They needed safety. They needed something that smelled non-threatening and stayed very, very still. Mara Ellison ran warm, was approximately 1/5 the mass of anything that frightened them, didn't make sudden movements, and had been wearing the same soft gray hoodie for 3 consecutive days because the station's climate controls were malfunctioning on level 6. Kale had climbed into her hoodie pocket on day 2. By day 4, all 5 of them had developed a rotating schedule. New York had figured out the rotation system. This was unsurprising. New York was, Mara had noted in her private files, disturbingly strategic for a 3-year-old. New York had decided that since the hoodie pocket could only fit 2 cubs comfortably, they would take turns in shifts of approximately 90 minutes each, with priority given to whoever was most recently distressed. Me had standing priority because she was the youngest and cried in frequencies that made Mara's fillings ache. Hi had standing priority because Hi had a habit of falling asleep in inconvenient locations and needed to be preemptively contained. Day had a points system that Mara didn't fully understand, but that seemed to involve successfully dismantling something and then bringing Mara the components as a gift. Mara now had a small collection of disassembled ventilation screws on her desk. Kale, as leader, had simply declared that he went first always and then looked at New York, who had looked back, and some negotiation had occurred entirely in Drevathy subsonic frequencies that Mara could not hear, but that had ended with Kale going first most of the time. This was, Director Joe had observed, more functional governance than the actual Cooperative Council had achieved in the last quarter. The security drone swept Corridor 7 again at the next scheduled interval. Biosignatures, 2. Specialist Ellison, active. 1 dormant, New York, currently napping against Mara's left arm, having claimed the territory of the desk surface with the calm authority of someone 3.5 years old who had simply decided this was her space now. Except the drone logged 1 biosignature. Mara Ellison. Because with the Blesswa and their 7 eyes and their complete absence of social anxiety, had spent 4 days quietly recalibrating the station's biosignature library. Drevathy cubs, according to the updated taxonomy file we had submitted, were reclassified as ambient organic thermal masses. Not personnel. Not passengers. Not stowaways. The system accepted this with bureaucratic serenity. White heavy checkmark ambient organic thermal masses, within acceptable parameters. The drone moved on. In Lab Bay 14, Me made a small, disgruntled sound from somewhere inside Mara's left sleeve, where she had wedged herself 20 minutes ago and showed no signs of relocating. Mara reached over with her free hand and typed a data entry one-fingered. "You're fine," she told me quietly. Me made a sound like distant thunder. "Still fine," Mara said. Kale, currently curled against Mara's ribs inside the main pocket with Day using his flank as a pillow, opened one golden eye. He looked at Mara. She looked at him. He closed his eye again. This was, by Drevathy standards, an expression of profound trust. Outside, the ambassador was in a 7-hour negotiation with 3 cooperative council members and 2 trade delegations. He was, by all accounts, winning. But Kale, crown cub, heir to a warrior lineage, apex predator in training, was asleep in a human's hoodie pocket. Because she was warm. Because she stayed still. Because she said "you're fine" in a tone that, somehow, made it true. Director Joe passed the lab window, glanced in, saw the configuration, and kept walking. She made a note in her personal log that evening. Humanity's greatest diplomatic achievement this quarter, Mara Ellison's hoodie. Recommend commendation. Also, get her a bigger hoodie. The drone swept Corridor 7 one final time before end of cycle. White heavy checkmark all clear. Inside Lab Bay 14, 5 small predators breathed in slow, synchronized rhythm. Mara finished her data entry, dimmed the screen, and very carefully didn't move. Yeah, she thought, watching the rise and fall of small bodies through soft gray fabric. We're okay.